So now that we've learned a little bit about what anthropology is and the anthropological perspective, we've talked a little bit about what culture is and why anthropologists are interested in studying culture. Now we're going to look at the how. How do anthropologists study other cultures? And so specifically what we're going to be looking at in this week's topic is fieldwork and the process of doing fieldwork. Now, I do want to distinguish that when we talk about fieldwork, even within anthropology, we can mean it in a couple of different ways. So when I talk about fieldwork as an archaeologist, it's a little bit different than what fieldwork looks like for other anthropologists, but that's okay. So we're going to return to that in a couple of weeks, so just kind of shelve that in the back of your memory. Instead, on this week, what I want to focus on is this piece of ethnographic fieldwork, and I've posted another video link to a short little video that gives you some different examples of what fieldwork in cultural anthropology looks like. So you'll recall that fieldwork is part of the anthropological perspective, right? It is the process by which we do anthropology. And I made this note here that both archaeological fieldwork and ethnographic fieldwork are not mutually exclusive activities, that they can occur in conjunction with each other. And here's an example of this, that my own research program, we've been doing ethnoarchaeological research on basket making in a community in southwestern Tanzania. So what do we mean by ethnographic fieldwork then? And remember that fieldwork falls under that broader category of participant observations. So the definition our textbook gives us this, and I think it works very well. It's this understanding that anthropologists will go somewhere, go someplace to work with a particular community, a particular group of people, and we will spend an extended period of time with the group of people that we have either chosen to work with or has asked us to come in and work with them. And this will allow us during this extended period to make those observations, to participate in that culture, and to collect our data. Now, a lot of other folks will emphasize the fieldwork piece of it, but I just want to also talk about how this is not a short thing, right? It's not like I wake up one day and roll out of bed and be like, today's the day I go do fieldwork. No, it's actually doing research in anthropology, like many other disciplines, is very time intensive, and actually in some regards we might spend a significantly long period of time preparing for fieldwork versus how much time we actually spend doing fieldwork. So here are some of the things that we have to do. We have to write up proposals, often because we need funding in order to support the research that we're undertaking. We need ethics clearance approvals, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in person, and there's slides that talk about the importance of ethical practices in anthropology, and we'll talk about how a little bit in class in our discussion on how ethics and participant observation and cultural relativism can all kind of come into conflict with each other in the context of doing fieldwork. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We need to plan out what we're going to do, and we refer to this something as research design. And so in our more senior level courses, we spend quite a bit of time with you folks going over the process. Well, how do we actually come up with a program of study? How are we actually going to investigate the questions that we have? And our written assignment this term is going to look a little bit about how do we actually come up with formulating a research question? How do we even know what we want to study? In many cases, it'll involve a lot of travel arrangements. So I remember when discussions around the COVID vaccine were first coming out, to me, I was actually kind of shocked to see how many people were surprised that a vaccine passport might be a thing that exists, because I've had one for 20 years now. Actually, I've had one my whole life, but I've had a travel one for over 20 years now, because archaeological fieldwork and fieldwork in general often takes us to places where we need additional vaccines. So having a vaccine passport's not anything really new to me, and we can talk a little bit about some of these other things that go into building fieldwork that are very normalized in the context of fieldwork, but do in some cases appear kind of extraordinary to people who are looking from outside, right? We need visas and permissions to enter countries, and where I work in Tanzania, we need permission to do research within that country. So it's not simply just going there and arriving there, but we need a series of permits and visas that basically give us the right permissions in order to undertake that research. And of course, then we have to book all the logistics around the trip as well, and the fieldwork itself. Oh, sorry. Once we're into the field, there's a number of other then things that have to do. Again, we don't jump right into the research, but there's a couple of basic steps. So depending on how many times we've been to a particular area, there might be a bit of navigation around this idea of culture shock. And I'm hoping some of you can share some of your experiences that you've had traveling or interacting with other kinds of groups and how that might have resulted in a culture shock scenario. And also how then as anthropologists do we navigate the experience and understand the experience of culture shock. Working in an unfamiliar language. So again, just becoming kind of acclimatized to the different cultural norms, the different practices, allowing our brain to switch over into a language that maybe we don't use as frequently in our non-fieldwork context. And then we can start to gather and collect our data. But again, even before we start data collection, we have to think about the different kinds of data that we want to collect. What kinds of observations are we going to be taking? What is our, and usually that comes back to what are we studying? So we might want to be taking not only a notes of what we are observing and what we're studying, but we might have other various forms of recording, so both film and sound that we might be capturing. And then once all of that's done, and it's not even often once it's done, but through the process of collecting data that we're constantly in a loop where we're also interpreting that data and then ultimately have a responsibility to report that data back to various authorities and other experts. So I mentioned we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I did want to say that, ethical practice is central to anthropology as it is with many disciplines. But how do we come up with ethics? And we'll talk a little bit more, we can talk a little bit more about what ethics are. What I want to emphasize at this point is that we have to remember that ethics are not laws, right? They are not rules that we must follow in which there will be consequences, but rather ethics are recommended ways of behaving and doing. And in some cases even thinking and approaching the kinds of work that we want to do. So ethics are not something that are generated by individuals, but rather are community-based. And so in anthropology, we have a number of professional associations around the world where anthropologists have come together and created these codes of ethics that outline what our core principles are going to be. And so here's a listing of just some of the major groups or professional associations that are out there. And note that many funding agencies, so people who support the financial aspect of doing research, of doing fieldwork, they also often have codes of ethics that we are expected to adhere by and follow by. So again, this is not something that I, as an individual researcher, decide these are what our best practices are going to be, but rather are, again, a broader community approach to ensuring that we are approaching our fieldwork in appropriate ways, we're conducting our fieldwork in appropriate ways, but again, it's ethics, not laws, and that's because what is or is not appropriate in the context of doing fieldwork, there is some interpretation around that. So what do some of these ethics look like? Well, in your textbook, they talk about the Tri-Council policy statement on ethical conduct relating to human research or human-based research. And these are the 8 principles that they've outlined. And many of these principles are reflected in other codes of conduct. So what do some of these look like? Well, you'll see that the goal of all of this is to maximize the benefits for the individuals who are involved in our research and minimize harm, right? So ultimately, that is kind of our primary goal as anthropologists and as researchers, that we maximize the benefit of us doing research within a community and minimize any of the harmful consequences of this. And I'll talk about what some of the benefits and also some of the consequences or negative consequences or potential sources of harm that might come up through the process of being involved in research. You notice that regarding this idea of benefit and harm maximization and minimization, that a lot of our emphasis, of course, is going to be on the human, on treating each other as humans, right? Ensuring that everyone has the right to dignity and respect, that they can consent to the process, that they can leave the research at any time without there being consequences for that, that we are going to respect that there are some members of our communities that are vulnerable. Children are a great example of this, that there's a lot of not only ethics, but rules and guidelines around how we engage with fieldwork over the course of our practice, because they're developing little brains and minds, and there can be serious consequences from being utilized as a research quote-unquote tool, right? So we're very aware of this. And of course, vulnerability can take many different forms. So one of the goals that we have as researchers is to attempt to identify what some of these various aspects of vulnerability might be. And we also have to note that sometimes we as ourselves can be put into vulnerable positions. So as a member of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, there are places where I myself might be at risk because of anti-queer, anti-homophobic rhetoric that might exist within those communities. So note that these ethics don't just apply to the people we do research with, but reflect also our own personal experiences and concerns around our own safety as well. Okay. Now, I mentioned that many of these codes of, sorry, I don't know where to put me. Let's put me right in the center there. So many of these codes of ethics are derived from these professional associations. So groups of anthropologists who've come together, often sharing similar research interests or a geographical locality or a time frame. There's a number of different ways that these various groups have been formed. But increasingly, one of the things we've seen, and by increasingly, I mean in the last 10 years or so, is having community groups and cultural groups defining their own codes of ethics that they would like researchers who are doing research in areas to follow. And so I posted a link here of the Khoisan people of the Kalahari in southern Africa who have been subject to research, not just in anthropology, but many other disciplines for a significant part of their recent history. And so as such, they've developed their own procedures and protocols for visiting researchers who want to come and work with them and with their communities. And I think that this is actually a really important shift that's occurring in academia and in research more broadly, is giving greater agency and empowering the groups that we work with and work for to set the tone for how that research is going to be undertaken. How is culturally sensitive information going to be protected? How is their integrity going to be protected? How is knowledge going to be protected? What are some of the consequences and outcomes of research? And thinking those through, because as we talked about when we were defining anthropology, is that some of the information and knowledge that we generate in anthropology is applicable to addressing what's going on in the real world. And so many of these groups have identified that, yes, having anthropologists work with them or coming up from within their own communities is important and valuable. However, again, we have to look at how we can better minimize some of the harmful side effects that have become, including the racialization of certain groups, increased discrimination. Anthropology itself has a really negative colonial history that we have to acknowledge if we're going to move forward. And so by looking to codes of ethics that have been generated internally, that can be a really powerful way of anthropologists not bringing kind of colonial mindsets and kind of freeing ourselves from kind of our own ethnocentric ideals around what should be happening in terms of research by following a community's lead. Now, your textbook spends some time talking about the different types of field work from kind of a historical approach. And many sciences and many disciplines within social sciences and humanities as well might take what we call more of a positivist approach. And anthropology had this as well, which is simply this method of approaching a question by which you're attempting to reveal the reality of how the world works, right? So you're kind of seeking out not only facts, right? So evidence to support your models and your theses and hypotheses, but also you're looking at producing tangible, objective outcomes or consequences, right? So what happens when I mix, chemical A with chemical B, and then I'm going to observe what happens. And then the idea is that because I'm the one who mixed A and B, and then I observe the resulting solution, that I can come up with some sort of objectable fact about what happened under the course of that research or that experiment. And so in anthropology, this very much kind of, there was already, I think, initially, even in early anthropology, some tension with this, right? So initially there was this attempt to treat our field environment, that's why we call it field work, is that we're going to the field to do study, and how we define the field can vary, and we can talk about this in our Collaborate session as well, is that it was kind of like a living lab, right? That we as the scientists, as the anthropologists would come, we could observe human behavior, that those instances of human behavior would be our facts that we would base our interpretations off of, right? The idea then was that if we wanted to replicate, right, what we saw in our field lab, right, in the our living laboratory, then we could do this through the use of controlled comparison. So for example, if I'm studying dance in one cultural group, I could observe dances there, and then I'll go in another cultural group and observe dances there, and then through comparison, maybe I can come up with some sort of explanation around the cultural significance and importance of dance, right? And the goal of this was not only, again, to come up with these kind of interpretations and conclusions, was that hopefully we could systematically and accurately capture cultural variation and kind of the key traits or attributes that are linked with various sorts of cultures. But this approach was very quickly questioned. So by the 60s and 70s, and I'm not going to go into the history of anthropological thought. Anthropology is a relatively young discipline compared to some of the other ones. But by the 60s and 70s, folks were starting to question this positive approach. And one of the key figures behind this was the work of Margaret Mead, who was initially actually doing some of her initial fieldwork in the 20s and 30s. So, and what she was arguing was that, and this is where we start to see this importance of ethics, is that the relationships that we build as anthropologists with the people we are studying is a little bit different, right? That we are not, again, an objective scientist who simply is only observing at arm's length distance what is going on in these cultures, that we are participating in these cultural practices. We are living within these communities for an extended period of time. And as such, that means that we cannot be simply objective, and more so also arguing that we do have obligations, ethical obligations to the people that we are working with, right? And this can therefore complicate not only the process of doing fieldwork itself, but also how we produce anthropological knowledge. And so this then led to a critique of the positivist approach in anthropology, arguing that anthropological fieldwork is not something that can be value-free, that instead it is something that exists more like a dialogue, right? That we are talking with people, they're asking questions of us. Often the questions I get a lot of are why? Why are you studying this particular topic? Why are you asking these kinds of questions, right? And that is also then triggering within my brain, me thinking and reflecting on this process of doing fieldwork. And so because there's this exchange that is occurring in the production of knowledge, because, and we'll talk about some other things as well, the data that we're producing is actually intersubjective. Okay, so what do we mean by intersubjective? Well, one of the things that people like Margaret Mead argued was that what we observe when we are undertaking fieldwork as a researcher, as an individual, is reflective of who we are as an individual and as a researcher as well. So for example, as a woman, I have access to different kinds of information and people are going to share different kinds of information with me because by virtue of me being a woman, but because not only am I a woman, but I am a mother. Individuals may talk with me a little bit differently. This is something I found very quickly in fieldwork, is when people found out I had a child, they wanted to ask lots of questions about it and find out about my experience of being a mother and what it was like to be away from her and all these different questions. And so again, what this means is that I'm building a relationship with people, but a relationship that is also dependent on who I am as a person and how I am building that relationship. That means that the observations then that I'm making that are coming out of the research I am doing are situated, right? They are specific to what I experienced, what I saw, who spoke with me, what I was able to access. A male colleague might have a different experience, even working with the same group by virtue of gender. And that can be only just one metric that can then shape the dynamics that exist within a fieldwork environment. Age also is something. I look fairly young. I used to look a lot younger, especially when I was younger. And so when I first started doing fieldwork, I was often treated as much younger even than I was. I was 19 and 20 years old, and I looked like I was about 12 or 13. And so this also shaped how people spoke to me, how they responded to my questions, how serious they took the role I had and the position I had. Now, as a professor, going and doing fieldwork, I'm treated much differently, right? There's a lot of respect that's been accorded to me by virtue of my position. So again, this means that the kind of anthropology I do now is very different than the anthropology I did when I was younger by virtue of age. It's also different because in the last 20 years, I've grown much and changed much. I've had other experiences that also shape my approach to fieldwork. And so these are the observations that anthropologists in the 60s and 70s were starting to talk about. And this led to what basically how anthropology is more practiced today, which is much more of a reflexive approach, right? So reflexivity relates to the process of thinking, and not just thinking, but thinking about how we produce knowledge. It's about being both self-aware, situational awareness, right? Being aware of the context in which we're producing anthropological knowledge, but also being critical of that as well, right? Again, acknowledging that we cannot talk to everyone, see everything, right? So again, on the basis of gender alone, I may not have access to various forms of information. A classic example of this is that as an individual who menstruates, other individuals who menstruate may feel more comfortable talking with me about menstruation and their experiences of menstruation than if I'm a non-menstruating individual, right? And especially if I don't meet cultural norms around what a menstruating individual should look like, right? So again, all of these different ideas then shape and influence the kinds of work we want to do. It also admits that our observations are situated, right? Again, our ability to access particular kinds of information and different types of people can change and shift over time. And it also means that we then have to avoid making those big, broad generalizations, right? We have to reject these kind of deterministic perspectives and recognize that, hey, at this particular period of time, at this particular place, this is what I observed, right? And someone else could come back a year later at the exact same place with the exact same people and make entirely different observations. And this, again, fundamentally reflects some of the other notions of how anthropologists approach this idea of culture, right? So if we acknowledge that cultures are dynamic, that they are constantly changing, that there's something that we learn, that they are adaptive and adaptable, then we have to anticipate people are the same as well. So of course we shouldn't be surprised that if I were to study a group of people today in 2022 and go back and study people that Margaret Mead worked with in 1922, even if some of the same individuals were still alive, I'm sure that even if I were to ask the exact same questions Margaret Mead did, I would get different responses, right? Because those people themselves have also changed over the last 100 years as well. But that said, just because we're recognizing that there's this kind of intersubjectivity that exists in the production of knowledge in anthropology, it doesn't mean that anthropology and our data collection cannot be detailed and accurate and that we cannot come up with very nuanced, important interpretations about a particular group of people, right? The key, though, is that we're always considering context, and this is really important, right? So we're considering things like the ethical and political context, right? Are people not comfortable talking about something because that's not something we talk about right now, right? People's vaccine status was something that we didn't really speak about in the pre-COVID days because many of us live in parts of the world where we don't have to, right? Where we have that privilege of not worrying that childhood vaccination is just something that is done. If people don't do it, it's not that big of a deal. Then we see this shifting in our own society with some very problematic papers that came out that were linking things like vaccine with other neurological variations. And then we have a pandemic happen, and now we have this much broader global discourse around vaccines and safety and all these concerns and questions, right? So as you can imagine, doing anthropology right now is largely shaped by this broader global context of the pandemic itself. The background of the researchers shape the kind of research we do, right? I might ask different kinds of questions because of my own personal interests, and that's okay. We do this all the time in science, but in anthropology, we're just a lot more explicit around our motives of what we study and why we study it. We also have a full partnership with our informants, and I mentioned this under the context of discussing the anthropological perspective, is that we don't have research subjects, right? What we have are people that we collaborate with in the production of knowledge, and in many cases collaborate with all the way through in various aspects of research design to ensure that we can have a fruitful, productive field season with each other. And there's a lot of shared process that occurs in this, and this is because of how do we actually do the field work? How do we actually collect data? What does it actually mean to do participant observation? Well, again, lots of examples in that MIT video doing anthropology link I posted. Interviews, of course, is a critical part of ethnographic fieldwork, actually talking to people. So it's not just observing what people are doing, kind of like that wildlife explorer who may watch cheetahs hunting warthogs. But they don't ever ask the cheetahs, like, so what interests you in that particular warthog? But as anthropologists, we do go, so how did you select that particular musical piece to perform to? What are some of the things that might shape the kind of steps that you chose? What about your costuming? What about the performance space, right? So we'd ask those different kinds of questions of the people that we are working with, and often respond to questions that they have of us as well. And so we have this kind of collaborative process of interviewing. And sometimes interviews can be very formal with a rigid list of questions. We can have very informal ones where you might have a couple of key things you want to ask about, then have more of an open conversation or dialogue around it. As in other social sciences, we do use things like surveys. They can be a very effective means of collecting data. We collect things like life history. So key people that we are working with who are kind of our guides, our experts, our mentors, our teachers, who are one of our primary sources of sharing cultural information with us. We'll often collect a lot of information about that person to find out exactly what their situation is within their community as well. So these are all critical ways that we can learn information. And so you'll see, we have a lot of these kind of pictures from fieldwork where it's the anthropologist sitting there with their notepad or their recorder or their phone or their recording devices and taking notes, photographs, video, etc., as they are engaged in data collection. Well, the production of anthropological knowledge, right? So actually finding out about people and culture are our goals. There are other effects of fieldwork or other outcomes from doing fieldwork. And some of these can be, again, both positive and negative. So, for example, there might be a disruption of understanding of self in the world. Because as anthropologists, we may be, again, asked, well, why are you studying this particular topic? Why did you come all this way to look at this here? Why are you interested in this? And then through that course of explaining, well, this is why I'm studying this is why I'm interested in it, we might be challenging some of the underlying notions that people have about the way the world is, about what they think is normal or as usual, what their own cultural practices are. And we may disrupt a little bit of that understanding as well. And that can either be very liberating for people, but it can also be very challenging. It can be very troubling as well, right, to do that. So we have to be aware of that as anthropologists and be able to provide appropriate supports for the people who are engaged in research with us. There can be economic gain or loss. So I've had some first-hand experiences of this where we will pay, for example, people to work with us at an archaeological site, and that brings an additional outcome into their household, but then they might be then perceived differently within their community. Oh, so you're working for the archaeologist, now you have all this extra money. So one of the things we saw in one of our communities, for example, was that the price of a goat, for example, went up significantly for people who are involved in our project because everyone knew they had this extra source of income coming in. And so this can then lead to both an economic gain in terms of additional money in their pockets, but then kind of loss in terms of being treated differently in the work in their day-to-day lives in the marketplace, etc. And so this can lead to a change in status. And again, this change in status can be positive. You might be acknowledged as a respected and trusted member of that group, or you might be treated now with distrust because you're sharing cultural knowledge with outsiders, and that's not appropriate to do. So again, our goal as anthropologists is going to fieldwork, thinking about what the various effects can be and working with our informants, working with our participants to maximize, again, the benefits and reduce the harm. We ourselves as researchers are not free of being impacted by the fieldwork we do. Again, in my 20 years of doing fieldwork, I know it's impacted me significantly as a human being, never mind as an anthropologist and as an archaeologist, right? So culture shock is something many of us experience, especially if we're working in a part of the world or with a community or with a culture that's very different from our own, right? So it's that kind of uncomfortableness that arises when things aren't the way we're used to it being. And this can impact you in a number of different ways. Smell, for example, different parts of the world smell differently than what smells like home. We don't really think about that. Cityscapes can smell differently. Rural environments can smell differently. Sounds, even just the noise level in different communities can be very shocking. Again, sometimes culture shock isn't an initial thing. For me, it usually happens a couple of weeks or months into fieldwork where I start to get this kind of longing for home, right, or the familiar. I'd love to have a Big Mac from McDonald's, and that's just not something that's available. I'm still eating, the food that I love there, but I just want a little piece of home. And so culture shock can have all these different pieces. built into it, and that can make it very hard for us to proceed through the process of fieldwork. Traditionally, cultural anthropology in particular was driven by this idea of like a single researcher going out on their own to do this kind of research, and this would lead to senses of feeling kind of isolated and vulnerable, right? You're now in this new community with this new group of people, you're off on your own, you're doing research. Usually for the first time, this can be really overwhelming. And now, and you don't have a colleague to turn to. Yes, the internet's made that a little bit better, but still the sense of isolation and vulnerability can persist. And again, this can only be then kind of further inflamed than if you are markedly different, right? So I remember my first time in Iringa village or Iringa town in Tanzania. One of the things I had to get used to that kind of made me feel very vulnerable, and again, it was just a sign of my own privilege back home, was that I was one of the very, very few white people in town. And so people were always talking to me, always engaging with me. I was getting pinched for attention. People would yell across the street at me, yell, "Mzungu, Mzungu, white person," right? And so I kind of felt vulnerable because I didn't have the privilege of just kind of hiding in the crowd anymore. I couldn't just go out shopping at the market. I was visibly different than everyone else, and not only different, but visibly an outsider, which was really critical. And so that shock of otherness could be very overwhelming, and can take some time to work through. And then we can also become both sensitized and desensitized for things. So one of the things I became very sensitized to is water scarcity. And so working in Tanzania and working in Africa, one of the things that really was hard for me initially was like the lack of recycling, because I was so used to like recycle culture being pushed so heavily here and then there. Glass bottles were reused, but a lot of plastic stuff was just thrown out, and I just, paper stuff, it was burned, and it was hard for me to kind of understand that. But so now I come home and I'm mad because someone's running the tap too long while they're brushing their teeth. I'm like, "You're wasting water, stop wasting water." And so now I'm kind of, very heightened sense of awareness of privilege and of benefits and of what people's needs are and all of these different things. So I became very sensitized to those sort of things. But then I became desensitized to other things. So I talk about race a little bit differently and racism a little bit differently because of the experiences I've had working somewhere where I have a lot of privilege due to the color of my skin, but I'm a minority. And so working through that, and also how race and skin color and variation is talked about is very different in Tanzania than here in Canada. So navigating these different things have also shaped me and shaped a lot of anthropologists. But what I want to celebrate is that while I've kind of talked about some of the harmful effects or some of the kind of areas of where tension might exist, is that one of the most lovely things of fieldwork is the humanizing effects. It's why we keep doing fieldwork. Is there something really valuable and lovely about experiencing the other, right? Getting to understand and experience what's going on in another culture, and not just kind of through the act of appreciation, but through participating and observing what is going on, through spending time getting to know people, and not just seeing a single performance, let's say, of a dance, or participating in a dance or learning the steps of a dance, but learning about the context, right? That holistic approach where we see how dance is situated, again, as just one example, within the broader cultural context. And it gives us, again, a grasp of the whole human experience by showing all these different ways in which we vary, but all the ways that we are also the same, all of the things that kind of fundamentally make us human. And that can be really liberating. And so humor, for example, we don't all tell the same kinds of jokes. But many of the communities I worked in, humor has been a really critical part of that. So learning how joking works and learning how jokes are effectively given. Landing a joke for the first time in another culture, in another language, is an incredibly satisfying experience, because you're connecting with people, you're laughing with each other, you're smiling. It's a really powerful and profound experience. But from a scientific perspective, from an academic perspective, what do we really care about this? The production of knowledge. And there's been a whole bunch of discussion about this. And so we can talk more about this in class this week. But I want you to think about how part of this means that, again, because anthropology, it has this reflexive piece to it, because it has this intersubjective piece to it. It means fieldwork is also open-ended, right? That we may go back and do more research, recognizing that, of course, what has happened, let's say in the last year, has been significant and will have impacted different groups of people, so we're not going to expect to find the exact same kinds of information. Is that sometimes there can be tension points that exist, and they're discussed in a number of different ways. So Agar, for example, talks about these kind of rich points where You might come into a point where you think you understand what's going on, so you're talking with your participants, and they're like, no, that's not quite how it is. And you're like, oh, but this is how I'm seeing it. And they're like, yeah, but you're seeing it wrong. That these kind of conversations can be really critical, rich points where we can kind of get at, okay, we're not understanding each other, and this is because profoundly of cultural differences, right? Because this is just a different way of understanding the world. And so that can really allow you to kind of get in and see those kind of nuances, right? It's kind of where we agree and where we see eye to eye isn't as fruitful or as productive as where we disagree, right? Where we're not understanding each other, at least from an anthropological perspective. What this means is that when we're producing what we call facts in anthropology, that it's very complex, right? So again, it's that situated production of knowledge that's really critical. Walsh talks about how mundane conversations are actually where a lot of really lovely, productive pieces of information come from in fieldwork, right? Just those kind of everyday conversations. That's where we get to learn a lot about culture. And again, we'll see lots of examples of this throughout the term. I think about this a lot in terms of how just being within another culture and walking around and just making observations, you see a lot of things. Again, how people queue in line. I use that as an example in a previous video. Learning those different rules through observation can be really powerful. And you just think, oh, well, you're just in line at the post office to get a stamp to mail a postcard back home. How much are you actually learning there? A lot, because the rules are different, right? And if they're not different, then I've still learned a lot, right? So it's kind of the mundane, the everyday that becomes really critical. And that's where anthropology, I argue, excels, because this isn't about a single point of observation, but again, these extended periods of time that we're spending immersed within these cultural communities, within these groups of people, getting to know about what life is really like for them and attempting to understand it as outsiders. Okay. But I don't want you thinking anthropology is not a science, because anthropology is a science, and your textbook does a good job of outlining how, if we look at how science is done, right, this process of coming up with a hypothesis that we can then test, right, that we collect evidence that we use to test and support our hypothesis, or potentially reject our hypothesis. If we get enough data to support our hypothesis and validate it, then now we have a theory that underpins how we understand a culture or a group. So yes, anthropology is a science, that we still follow all these different practices of what a science is. It just looks a little bit differently, right? Because what we do for experimentation is we study small populations, small groups, and we do so in an empirical manner. We gather both quantitative and qualitative forms of data. We model realities, right? We generate hypotheses, we come up with theories, we come up with interpretations. We have this comparison is where we're doing testing, right? So we can't always replicate the exact conditions, but that's not the goal here, right? It's not about replication, it's understanding that's the key. And we also make statements around probability as well, right? That if, for example, if we see that, oh, well, we know that something is not a preferred food source, then the probability of someone hunting, for example, this particular type of animal, if we know that they don't eat it, is probably very low, right? Like that's a very low probability of that, because that's simply not something people eat as food. And we know that through extensive studies and through comparing with other kinds of folks and the kind of work that they do. Okay. So what are some of the highlights then that I want you to think about is that fieldwork is not just one thing, right? And nor is it a simple process. It takes a lot of preparation that leads us into the field. And then when we're in the field, the forms that it can take vary a lot based on who we are as the anthropologist and the groups that we are studying. And this means that it affects everyone involved in this process, right? That there are both positives and negatives that impact both the anthropologists and the people that we are working for. While our main goal is the production of anthropological knowledge and seeking to understand other people, other places, other cultures better, we want to do so in a way that, again, minimizes the harmful effects of the kinds of research we do and maximizes the benefits of it. And so, again, we're going to see lots of examples of fieldwork throughout the term, and we'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit more. And I can share some more of my experiences doing fieldwork, if you'd like, in our Collaborate sessions. So take care, everyone, and I will see you all then.